there's a wonderful verse that I want to share with us as we get started. And forgive me, Lisa, if I throw you out of whack here, which I think I might a little bit. And the first verse that I had there comes from, what did I give that? Do I have that Mark verse somewhere, Lisa? I'm not sure if I've got it in my notes here. I do. Can you throw it up on the big board for us? So Mark 10:45, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And so this verse, in a really wonderful way, captures almost the core identity of who Jesus is and why he came. In his greatness, not to be served by others, but actually to give his life in service of others. And you see this repeated time and time again through the life and ministry of Jesus, that this defines who he is. So this is what we're going to be leaning into. I'm excited to be getting stuck into this. But before we do, I've got a little bit of a challenge for us here this morning, a little bit of a game that's going to test some of your thinking. And in fact, Tash, could you pass me that tape measure? Does anyone else like to... Oh, I was wondering if you were going to throw it. I would be nervous if you did. Does anyone else like measuring things? I'm a measurer. Not so much with tape measures so often, but I love measurements. I love metrics. I love data that can inform how things are progressing. And I love it in particular when metrics are crystal clear. Does anyone else like that? Where it's just like there's no guessing. It's just like I know exactly how much that thing weighs. I know exactly how big that thing is, or whatever it might be. So at a glance, here's the challenge, church-wide challenge. In centimeters, how tall do you think this black table is? 110. Good guess. Wait, did you know that already? Because you do some creative things with furniture, and you live with so we've gone with the standard bench height, 110. That's a good guess. Now, who here fancies themselves a good measurer? A measure once, cut once kind of person? Come on, is that Musa? Musa, can you come up and measure this? Actually, this is perfect. So Michelle, Musa's wife, guessed the 110. And now, Musa, can you just give us a perfect measurement of the table? 110 is the go. No, you can't say. Let's line it up. My eyes are actually going as well. It's 105. It's a non-standard bench height. 105. It's a topic, maybe 106 maximum, but thank you, Musa and Michelle, for that unplanned comedy as part of our service. So I really enjoy it when we have things that we can measure, that we can have absolute clarity about. Whether it's, tracking things in sport like field goal percentage and efficiency, whether it's tracking the temperature that we just know with clarity, it's exactly this much or it's exactly that much. But then, of course, in life, there's all these kinds of things that it's really hard to get an exact measurement on. It's really hard to exactly define how much there is. And it could be simple things like how good something tastes. I can't measure that. I can describe it, and I've got to feel a little bit more differently with the words that I choose. But some things are far more difficult to get a concise measurement of. And one of the things that I think is especially tricky is how to get a sense of what I'd call our spiritual temperature. How we're going in the place of the heart and in the place of the soul. So often I wish there was something like this, that I could just say, okay, here's how I'm going in the soul, and stretch out my tape measure and know exactly what I need to do. But I don't have that luxury, because in the place of the soul, it works a little bit differently. So one of the questions I have as we start into this service is, how do we take the temperature of our soul? What thermometer do we reach for to get a sense of how we're going in that spiritual arena of our heart and life? The wonderful thing is that in the teachings of Jesus, he consistently points to this one idea. If you want to know, I guess, a strong indicator of how things are going in the place of the soul, Jesus gives us this repeated illustration. And coincidentally, I guess the best one comes from the Sermon on the Mount, which through term one we spent a lot of time with. And thankfully, this particular portion of the Sermon on the Mount we didn't spend all that much time with. So what I want to do is read this particular verse that comes from Matthew 7, verses 16 to 20. And here's Jesus kind of answering the question, what thermometer do we use to measure our spiritual temperature? And this is what he says. By their fruit, you will recognize them. So this key picture symbol of fruit. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Now, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. So this wonderful imagery that Jesus has of fruit being produced by a vineyard, a crop, wherever it might be, is actually the evidence of health. It's actually the thing that points to the soul being in the right condition. Now, one of the things about service that I love, and this will really be the big idea coming out of this, and I'm going to borrow from John Mark Comer from Practicing the Way, and he thinks about the practice of service in this way. The spiritual practice of service is this. It's the expression of Christ-like love through meeting the practical needs of another, especially those most in need of our help. So service being the practical expression of love. And I love that as a picture of the kind of fruit that Jesus is talking about. Love expressed as practical service. The willingness to lay down something of ourselves to give life to another. And of course, doesn't that just sound the absolute core of who Jesus is? The willingness to lay down life, to offer life to others. So that's how Jesus frames it. But it's not always what I reach for. How do I tell if I'm hot in the soul, cold in the soul, lukewarm of the soul? If I'm honest, sometimes these are the things that I look to. Maybe I do a review of my moral decisions, the anger or patience I displayed in my speech this week, maybe the content I engaged with online, maybe having one too many on a Friday night. We could look to our moral decisions to find a gauge of our spiritual temperature. Or perhaps we could look to our spiritual practices. How often do I find myself reading the Bible, engaging with God's Word? How often do I find myself in times of prayer or creating spaces to worship God? How present am I within church community? I could look at the practices and say, it's the practices that I can know how I'm going in my soul. And if I'm honest, this is the one that sometimes my heart inclines towards. And as I go a little further, we'll share that there's some dangers associated with that. So sometimes it can be our spiritual practices. Or for you, it could be other things. It could be the music that you've been listening to lately. How prone you are to doom scrolling. Maybe how prone to gossip you've been in the people in your world. How critical or judgment towards others you've been. So the question becomes, what thermometer do you use to check your spiritual temperature? And I believe this is a really important question because it isn't exactly clear which unit of measurement to use. If we reach for the wrong thermometer, it can actually take health away from the soul rather than giving health to the soul. So if we measure with the wrong measurement, it can actually do more harm than good. So Jesus showed us this new thermometer, the fruit that we bear. You know, my wife really enjoys growing veggies in the garden. And if I'm completely honest, I have no idea how she does it. I go out there at a certain time, I see sprouts, sometimes sprouts that I might recognize as the top of a carrot, sometimes sprouts that I might recognize as spinach, sometimes sprouts that I might recognize as broccoli. I'm pretty good at spotting the broccoli now. It's been a few seasons. But to me, there's a real air of mystery about it. The plants go in at a certain point, and then at another point, vegetables come out on the kitchen bench. And we have broccoli coming in and spinach coming in, and it just kind of appears. And I know that she goes out there, she does things, but to me, it's really a mystery how those vegetables grow. It's a mystery what she does. Now, obviously, I could be a little bit more present with the process, and it would become less of a mystery. But to me, it's kind of a mystery. And when I go out there and there's little sprouts, sometimes I can guess what they are, sometimes I can't. But I do know the real evidence of health in those sprouts is eventually they're going to produce something that comes into the kitchen. Now, my wife, who's a gardener, would know all the nuance and the other little things that point to the health of the plants. But ultimately, the health of that plant is defined by whether it produces the fruit that it was intended to produce. That's ultimately how I can see it. And this is exactly Jesus' point. That spiritual temperature is all about the character and the behaviors that are being produced from the inside out in who we are. This is the measurement. Not how often I'm in my Bible, not how often I'm praying, but actually the character and behaviors that's being produced as a result of the indwelling of God in my life. This is the measurement to reach for. So let's take hold of Jesus' picture of fruitfulness here. And I want to describe this through 3 different ways before we finish up this morning. The first is being fruitless. Being fruitless. The second, being fruitful. And then the third that we're going to land on is actually coming to displaying first fruits. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a few moments' time. But to start with, let's look at this idea of being fruitless. Now, there was a particular community of people that Jesus often interacts with and challenges throughout the account of his life through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day. Now, they did so many things right. They did so many things well. In terms of spiritual practices, they led the way in every possible way you could think of. They were disciplined. They were focused. They did all the things that people would kind of think of doing to bring health to the soul. But even though they did all of those things so passionately, the fruit that was growing out of them was not good. They were judgmental. They were harsh. They had a heart inclined to punishment. The fruit that was growing out of them just wasn't good. And so Jesus often challenges them. And I want to take you to another one of the occasions where Jesus speaks of fruit. This time it comes from Matthew 12, verse 33. And again, he says this, "Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit." He's repeating the exact same idea. But in this scenario, it's fired a lot more like an arrow at the heart of the Pharisees. Because Jesus' verse here and what he has to say about fruit actually triggers with the Pharisees challenging something in the life of Jesus' disciples. There's an occasion as Jesus and his friends, his followers, are traveling from one place to another. And they're walking through a field. And in the field, there's grain growing. And it's ripe for the picking. So as the disciples are walking through their field, they're feeling a little bit snacky, and they don't have pantries with nice treats like us. They had these heads of grain. So as they're walking, they pluck a grain, they ruffle it in their fingers to get the grain out, and they just start snacking on it. And they're munching, they're probably laughing, telling stories as they walk through this field. Now, for the Pharisees, there was a problem, because the day that they were doing this was the Sabbath. And if you're unfamiliar with the tradition of Sabbath and the law of Sabbath in the Old Testament, it was basically you couldn't do any kind of work. That was a day for honoring God, for the worship of God, where they completely rested. And that was part of the law. And so the Pharisees saw the disciples doing this, and they said, "Jesus, they're harvesting on the Sabbath. They're breaking the law. That's terrible what your disciples are doing." And Jesus' basic response to them is, "You're missing the forest for the trees." He reminded them of an occasion in the life of David, who was a heroic king in Israel's history that they all knew of, that even David did this same thing. And Jesus' point is, and it's such an important one, is that the how of spiritual formation should never outrun the why of spiritual formation. And this is what I'd say, this entirely describes everything that was broken in the Pharisees. And it's such a shame, because they had such a passion to do the things that would draw them closer to God. But they just had this one hiccup, this one fatal hiccup for their soul, is that the how outran the why. And when the how of spiritual formation outruns the why of spiritual formation, it often has this effect of actually deforming us further away from Christ. So the why being to love others with a heart of service. That's the whole point of it. But if the how outruns that, and it's all just about, this is what needs to be done, this is what you need to do, if you're not doing this, you've missed it, based on all the spiritual practices. But it's actually about the why. Now, the how has a part to play, but the why needs to be the focus. Now, here's a way to describe the why as we pivot towards being fruitful. You know, there's a verse here that's so central to who we are as a church, and I even spoke about this last week. And it's the greatest commandment, Matthew 22. And this just captures so perfectly what Jesus is talking about here. The why set against the how. And we pick up in verse 37. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So this is another way of Jesus saying this is what it means to display the right kind of fruit in your life. Is spiritual formation leading you to a place where you're loving God more deeply and loving others more deeply? And the expression of how we love others is captured in the willingness to be a person of service. In love, am I prepared to lay down something of myself to bring a portion of life to another person? What a wonderful way to describe what biblical love is for another. This is the why. And when the how outruns the why, we're not drawn to that. In fact, often like the Pharisees, we can be drawn to judgment and say, why aren't you doing the how? Instead of how is the how leading me to the why? To have a heart for others. You know, there's this wonderful line from Dr. Robert Mulholland, and I'll capture it with this phrase first, that all spiritual practice is meant to free us to become people of love. I love that. That's what the practices are for, freeing us to become people of love. And Mulholland frames it this way, that spiritual formation is actually for the sake of others. And I love this because it takes our lives to the why. Then we're not just stuck on the how, but we're actually like, this is what the work of engaging with the Spirit of God is for. It's actually for other people so that we can partner with the work of God, displaying the love of Jesus to those in our world. So am I becoming a person of love to the people who know me best and interact with me most frequently? You know, I want to give you a moment now just to answer that question in your own heart and mind. And I'm going to give you a couple of questions to help you process that within your own heart. Are you ready to do that? Search inward a little bit. And again, really what I'm asking is, how do we check our spiritual temperature? Here's some things to reflect on. The gentle or harsh tone I use with my spouse, family, or friends. The interruptibility, or lack thereof, I embody towards my neighbors. The patience I carry or don't carry towards my kids. The compassion I offer my co-workers or judgment I chip away at them with. And then the reminder that the thermometer that takes our spiritual temperature is love expressed practically as service. I want to take you back to one final idea. So we talked about being fruitless, being fruitful. And then there's this wonderful idea, almost a little bit hidden in Jesus' words here, about first fruits. Now, occasionally, Jesus will do something where he talks about the age that is to come. This wonderful promise that Jesus came and in his resurrection gave life to all. But also the promise that he will come again to make all things new, to renew creation back to Eden, perfection in everything that God intended. So that's coming. And occasionally Jesus talks about that, and biblically the word for it is apocalyptic language, where Jesus talks about the end times and the renewal of all things, where God's truth, justice, peace, and reign will finally be secure. And it speaks to this reality that at the present day, we're kind of in between two kingdoms. And what I mean by that is the age that is and the age that is coming in Jesus. And Jesus is aware of that. So every now and again, he uses this language that points to the coming ultimate renewal of his kingdom. And the way that's evidenced in our verse that we looked at here today around fruit, there's this fairly firm part of it that I want to engage with for a moment, where he says that every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And what Jesus is referencing here is the coming renewal and justice at the end times. And again, he does it in a similar way where he talks about the parable of the vine and the branches, the exact same thing, that a portion of those branches will be cut away, that they're not bearing fruit. And initially it sounds like this really hard, harsh kind of truth to engage with. But what it actually speaks to is this kind of wonderful opportunity that we have to recognize that we are in between two times. And there's this wonderful picture that the Apostle Paul gives us as he reflects on the resurrection of Jesus. And forgive me, I don't have this verse on the screens. But if you want to look it up, we're going to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20. And this, if you've got a Bible, this might be worth picking up. So Paul describes the resurrection of Jesus upon the cross in this way. He says, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead." And here's that word, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So Paul's making a comment about the resurrection of Jesus as being the first fruits of the resurrection, the fullness of life, the wholeness of life that we have access to when we put our faith in him. But it also speaks to the coming resurrection, eternal life, and the renewal of all things. And so Paul looks at the resurrection of Jesus as the first fruits of that. Now, there's kind of two ways we can understand that word or that idea of first fruits. The first is like it's the first of the harvest. So remember, in Jesus' world, it's primarily an agrarian culture, and it's all about the harvest. And the first fruits, there was actually an offering attached to it that they would give of the very first of the harvest. That's one way of thinking about first fruits. But there's another way you can think about that phrase, that the first fruits is when out of season, the fruit starts to come. So again, I don't know much about growing stuff, but occasionally things come early and it's like this unexpected surprise. You're like, wow, that carrot shouldn't be showing up yet, but here it is. That head of broccoli shouldn't be sprouted yet. Is that what broccoli does? It sprouts. Feels like something a broccoli would do. But here it is, ahead of schedule, out of season. It's this promising fruit out of season as a picture of the inevitable change of season and what's to come. So this is part of how Paul looks at the resurrection of Jesus. This is life out of season, promisingly out of season. And then what I love about the way of reflecting on the fruit or lack thereof that grows out of who I am in accordance with Jesus is that when we, as followers of Jesus, begin to display the fruit of his coming kingdom, where all things are going to be made right, where it's going to be renewed, where it's going to be healthy, where it's going to be whole, where it's going to be life overflowing for all. When we start living as people who love sacrificially, that offer service to others, we start operating as if that renewed kingdom has already come. And then we become like first fruits of the ultimate renewal of what God's doing. Did everyone stay with me with that? Like, I think this is a really important idea of what God can actually do through his church. That we can actually be the first fruits of our world, of the inevitable coming of Jesus making all things new. That we can be those who are pleasantly out of season. Fruit beginning to grow in accordance with the kingdom that's coming and not the kingdom that is. And so what Jesus is speaking to here, and what Paul often speaks to, is that we've kind of got the opportunity to live in alignment with one of two ages. The age that is, it's defined by a lot of brokenness, or the age that's coming, that is defined by the renewal of all things. And the fruit that grows out of us can actually be the first fruits that points towards that coming kingdom of Jesus. I think that's amazing. I don't know if that's resonating with you guys, but I think that's an incredible opportunity that God invites us to partner as being the revelation of what his kingdom is doing in our world. And the coolest thing about it is that it expresses itself in the most simple, everyday things. So how do we start to take hold of this? If we're saying, okay, I recognize that it's about the fruit. It's about what's growing out of my life. So how do I get intentional with that? I think a great phrase is to just say, start where you are and start today. And here's a challenge that I want to offer you for this week. And it's a really simple challenge. And some of you, God might have been doing a work in your own heart and your own soul around this arena of your life for a long time. And for you, there might be more to take hold of. But for all of us, this is something we can do. To do one specific, intentional act of service this week. That's what I want to invite you to do.